Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are just giving a few moments to allow people to join the webinar. Welcome, everyone. So I will begin our webinar. Welcome. My name is Anna. I am a project assistant at Scrap Weapons and a recent graduate from SOAS University of London in the Politics and International Studies department. Co-moderating with me today is Jess.
Hi everyone, my name is Jess. I'm a project assistant at Scrap Weapons and a student of International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS.
It's really great to have you all here to launch the first of our webinar series on feminist leadership in disarmament. This is our second year implementing this webinar series, and this year we will be looking more closely at the Women, Peace and Security agenda that was formally established in the year 2000 through the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, and also looking at feminist foreign policy. And so the idea is to discuss these two agendas and projects and their relationship with establishing or not general and complete disarmament, which Scrap Weapons is intrinsically connected to. Today, our topic of discussion will be the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, reframing the WPS agenda. This webinar seeks to address gaps in the WPS agenda, particularly pertaining to security and the need for reforms to incorporate and address general and complete disarmament. And so today we are honored to be joined by three fantastic speakers: Her Excellency Linda Scott, Inas Milud, and Bina Lakshmi or Bina Nepram. And so just before we start, I'll run through a little bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and it will be published on the Scrap YouTube channel in the next couple of days. Once all of our speakers give their presentations, we will open up the floor for an audience Q&A session. So please add your questions via the Q&A function. And if possible, it would be great to have your name and affiliation. And you can start leaving questions whenever you'd like. And so now I will hand over to my colleague Jess, just to introduce Scrap Weapons in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Anna. So Scrap Weapons aims to advance the disarmament agenda by way of providing the international community with both intellectual and practical tools for its implementation. These include a draft treaty for the realization of the legal commitment to nuclear and general disarmament in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and prototypes of a global weapons tracking system that provides transparency against illicit arms trafficking. At Scrap, we are now working to organise a conference on activating a fourth special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly, to be hosted at SOAS University of London in September. We aim to build a global constituency to revive the debate on general and complete disarmament at the United Nations in the near future, and we invite everyone to participate and support our work. You can find more information on our website at the link that will be posted in the chat.
Thank you, Jess. And so without further ado, I will now introduce our first speaker of today, Her Excellency Linda Scott. Her Excellency is serving as a Namibian High Commissioner to the UK and Northern Ireland. She previously served as personal assistant to the then Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, now the Deputy Prime Minister, Netumbo Nandi Ntaitwa, who was a rapporteur to the Beijing Conference on Women in 1995. And for us here at Scrap Weapons, it is very important to highlight at this moment the crucial role played by Namibia in tabling Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security agenda at the UN in the year 2000. As scholar Cornelia Weiss has noted in her contribution to the book by Rebecca Adami and Dan Plesch, called Women in the UN, A New History of Women's International Human Rights, it was women from Namibia who served as initiators, drafters, and strategists in creating UN Security Council Resolution 1325. This fact, unfortunately, has been often neglected in women's rights discourses globally, and Namibia has still not received well-deserved credit for placing the issue surrounding the impact of armed conflict on women and girls, the role of women in peace building, and the gender dimensions of peace processes and conflict resolution on the UN Security Council agenda. And just to finish off and to add, today in Namibia, almost 50% of parliamentarians are women. And so, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Anna. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. It's wonderful to be connected again with SOAS, especially on a topic which is so near to my heart. I thought that given the current circumstances in which we find our world, allow me to just start that by saying that as a Namibian, like all of us here, I'm pained by the horror and devastation that war brings, and that those of us who've lived through war know and remember all too well what pain and suffering that inflicts, the dreams that it shatters and the hopes that it destroys. And to say that our hearts and our thoughts and prayers go out to the victims, their families, and all those affected by the bloody war between two neighbors. And that the humanitarian and security crisis, especially on women and children, which, if left unchecked, may have catastrophic consequences for international peace and security. So, participants, on 31 October 2000, Namibia was privileged to be on the UN Security Council. And thank you, Anna, for making reference to the fact that we were able to usher in the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. So when Namibia joined the United Nations Security Council that year, women were being discussed on the Security Council only as victims of violence and conflict. And the main focus was on rape as a weapon of war. Yet women were not yet being included in dialogues and conversations around peace or political fora, nor were they generally participating in negotiations. So Resolution 1325 led the world towards resolutions that recognized the inclusion of women in peace negotiations as essential to obtaining and maintaining peace. Now, fundamental to 1325, however, was the recognition that women are not merely passive victims of conflict, but that any conversation on peace, on disarmament, must begin with inclusive dialogue and the political participation of women. The need to include women in peace dialogue echoes across time, and I think you'd all agree on that one. But let me take you back for a moment to my own childhood. I grew up as a privileged white child under martial law imposed by the apartheid South African government in colonized Namibia, which was then known as Southwest Africa. All white children were being prepared for war. And every Wednesday for an hour and a half at school, we would have youth preparedness. We were taught to march, to shoot, to fight fires. And we were exposed to the Hearts and Minds campaign that was there to indoctrinate us on the need to fight the enemy, which were essentially our own country, women and men. And we were in effect child soldiers being prepared for war. All boys in the country, white and black, with few exceptions, were expected to join the military from the age of 16. You were only exempt as long as you were studying. Now, our society was impregnated by conflict and by the war. No one was excluded. Civilians and children were involved, believe me. It took me many years to realize that the myth of men going off to war, leaving women and children behind, was a lie. And after our independence, which we gained in 1990, just after the Berlin Wall fell, the conflict rang in our ears as women who were soldiers returned to a peaceful society and were then expected to accept a passive role by returning to the kitchen, as it were. We also found that the war continued to impact our country through severe inequalities and distrust, socioeconomic and post-colonial factors that are reflected across the world. In 1995, as a young diplomat, I was privileged to attend the Fifth World Conference on Women held in Beijing. I want to say that if you've not read the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, I certainly encourage you to do so. It has much to add to the discussion on feminist leadership, including on disarmament. One of the fundamental paragraphs negotiated by the thousands of participants was the need to establish educational programs for children everywhere, to foster a culture of peace and tolerance that would include elements of conflict resolution, mediation, reduction of prejudice, and respect for diversity. Feminization of leadership in disarmament means that we aim for our society to experience equal management or governance or responsibility by women and men for disarmament. If, as a world society, we are serious about strengthening peace at the grassroots of building a genuinely de-armed society, then this is the fundamental education to be integrated into our national systems. I believe that Namibia perfectly demonstrates how war and violence insinuates itself through socioeconomic realities into every aspect of society, even after the peace deal has been signed. Many countries have benefited from the generation of a new spirit of disarmament, which was encouraged by UN Security Council Resolution 1325, primarily through subsequent laws and policies introduced and implemented. We have, for instance, seen gender equality and the empowerment of women mainstreamed in many countries, including across the African continent. The focus on silencing the guns in Africa has highlighted how African feminist approaches to peace result in relevant policies. But feminist disarmament is not merely about negotiating policies. As Anna said, Namibia now has almost 50% female representation in our parliament, and we ranked 15th in the world in this category. In October 2020, the International Women's Peace Center was opened in Windhoek, our capital city, unfortunately during the throes of COVID. But one of the center's primary goals is to educate peacekeepers, to develop advocacy and networking across the region and globally on the WPS agenda, and to grow local and international women capacity on peace and security. The center also aims to enhance research and data collection as key to enhancing mediation and negotiations, and to address gender-based violence during conflict and post-conflict. Governments around the world have joined in a Women, Peace and Security Global Focal Points Network to ensure that the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is monitored. From 2018, SADC member states also began reporting to the regional body about their national activities and policies as they relate to the effective implementation of the WPS agenda in their countries. So it's pretty mainstreamed already. You know, I could go on about how far we've come and what we've achieved. But if we do not educate our young people, how do we expect to see change in future generations? We will continue to see a world engulfed in division, death, breakdown of our societal gains, and a worsened global socioeconomic reality. It really is only through reworking the formal processes and systems that make up our society, such as our education systems, in order to shift the way we think about the inclusion of women and of course about building a feminist leadership within the disarmament conversation. It's only as we normalize and fully mainstream the involvement of women at every level that sustainable systems and dialogue around peace building will be more sustainable. The role of women in peace building is a priority for us all. It affects every one of us. The case of Namibia is a perfect demonstration of this. Namibia recognizes that implementing the African and UN agendas demands that women, peace and security be mainstreamed in all developmental plans and aspirations. And as we seek to reframe the WPS agenda, we must all learn the language of peace, of tolerance, of justice. We must simply include women in leadership in disarmament. Allow me to end by quoting the poem Legacy by Rupi Kaur. I stand on the sacrifices of 1 million women before me, thinking, what can I do to make this mountain taller so that the women after me can see further? Let's build our legacy from the ground up on the history of those who've gone before us so that we can see a disarmed future for our young people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. That was a really, really moving presentation. I think just hearing your personal experience is really humbling, and I think you really touched on the importance of focusing on women in peace building. I think quite commonly we just associate putting women in military institutions as kind of a solution, but I think really emphasizing women in peacekeeping is so essential. So that was really enlightening. Thank you so much. So now I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Ines Milud. Ines is an Indigenous feminist activist. She is the former lead coordinator of 1325 Network in Libya and former Indigenous Senior Fellow at the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples. She is the co-founder and currently co-executive director of Tamazight Women's Movement, an intersectional organization that works to address gender, youth, and Indigenous peoples' inequalities in Libya. Her works have been particularly focused on gender, peace and security, militarization, Indigenous issues, and intersectionality. Ines, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you so much, Her Excellency, for, as you said, Jessica, moving intervention, but also to join you in solidarity with all the victims and all the affected population because of war and that are residing in war zones. And also in recognizing the contributions of Namibia to the normative framework of 1325, to have a political willpower and the importance of a political willpower to achieve what we see as feminist imaginations and feminist aspiration. The power, actually, electricity just cut right now, but I hope you can see me and hear me fine. I'm sorry for the
no worries, we can hear you well.
You can also see what's happening, but I hope you can hear me. I think speaking about feminist disarmament has been an urgent and needed issue, not only for feminist civil society, but also women in all their diversities in Libya. The impact of arms on the daily basis in Libya today, not only limiting women's freedom, but also risking people's lives, you know? And I think when we speak about Libya, I want to give you a little bit of context. In 2011, when the revolution started, peaceful, and many of the women, indigenous women, and young people have claimed the street and to find this momentum an important stage to realize the changes and transformation that we all need to advance gender equality and gender justice and indigenous justice. However, that has been completely shifted when the NATO interventions occurred in Libya. The NATO intervention did not only affect what we see Libya today, the gender impacts of this intervention, but also affected the national identity and the power relations between communities and within communities in Libya. And that's quite important. And this has been detected early on by feminists calling out for these armed groups, calling out for the violations contributed by armed groups, and calling out on stopping financing these armed groups. It's very important to look at the situation in Libya from also an imperialistic and colonial lenses. We can see that these armed groups that has been backed by NATO and different member states at different stages, these have political and colonial ties with specific parties in Libya. I think that affected severely the power dynamics, in particularly when it comes to indigenous peoples. And when we think about 1325 or the frame of 1325 from intersectional perspective, it's important to not only emphasize on this narrow conversation about participation of women in peace negotiations only, but also understanding what meaningful participation of indigenous women and population within these discussions are. We see a lot of progress have been done and evidence have been showed that the more women are in the peace table, that means the likability and likelihood of implementing these peace agreements on the ground will occur. That's correct. However, we still see even this demand in the women, peace and security work in Libya. This demand of including women is still not established yet. In 2015, the first formal negotiation started in Libya. Perhaps only 1% of women were participating in the different tracks. And we see that this percentage has changed today to 17% of women participating in 2019, in 2020. And that has resulted again in great transformation when it comes to language and when it comes to demands of women to incorporate within the political agenda and peace in Libya. However, the violation and the shrinking space on civil societies continue to prevail, but particularly targeting feminist and women's rights group. Last year in November, a protest and demonstration happened in Libya to attack feminism and to attack all of the women's rights group that are calling for 1325 agenda and the CEDAW, an important international treaty to end all forms of discrimination against women and girls in Libya. This has consequences because it's backed by the government that is supported by the international community. The consequences is the shrinking space of feminists who are calling for issues such as our arms and issues that are affecting our realities. This is not an elitist-based discourse. This is a discourse that are based on the grassroots and what is happening on the ground. This has consequences on the continuing of work of women, peace and security, but also in advancing gender justice and gender equality agenda in Libya. It's important to note the severe military presence and military patriarchal performance in Libya, and this issue has to be linked with financing. Who is financing these groups that are not only limiting basic human rights to women, indigenous women, and affected population, but also risking their lives? I think there's not much attention are being paid towards this element of work that feminists have been put forward to the international community and external mediation and external member states. This element of work that calls out specific member states interfering on enhancing these, on increasing these violations that is happening to daily basis. An example of this is what's happening to the migrants and migration issue in Libya, the issue that is deemed by the government as a national security matter. So even speaking about it, a civil society organization, it's a national security matter. But what's more serious is that these groups that are committing violation against migrants are being funded by EU member states. I think when we talk about reframing 1325 resolution, not only to focus on women's participation within police and military forces, but meaningfully include women within discussions about military. In the what's known as the Joint Military Commission, or 5+5 military track in Libya, there are 10 members and none of them are women. Inclusion of women is a priority to address all of these issues that are not only that are structural and that are imperative to peace building in Libya. And finally, I would like to end with some recommendations that I see that are very significant to feminist disarmament, but also moving the 1325 agenda in Libya and in the global South. First is to defund these armed groups. We have to stop financing them and calling for accountability and sanctions to these member states that are funding them. Stop the sale of weapons that are being used to perpetuate violence and gender inequality in daily basis. All member states have to uphold the international law, but particularly the Arms Trade Treaty and the UN embargo that is currently completely ineffective because of this lack of specific measure to combat that. Security reform and disarmament has to be also done through feminist analysis, because feminists are providing a lot of tools and a lot of work around that, and they must be heard. Of course, meaningfully include women and indigenous women and young people to these discussions, these high-level discussions that impacting our lives. We cannot have a government without us agreeing on this government in Libya. We cannot have elections without us agreeing on having these elections. This interference has to be done, and we need to have a meaningful engagement, particularly with women and indigenous women and all women in all their diversities. Incorporate feminist analysis and an alternative to respond to this armament. It's very crucial to create policies that are responding and are centered around peoples instead of political and the interests of member states interfering in Libya. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ines, for sharing your experience, for bringing in the example of Libya into the discussion, and this point that is very important of needing an intersectional perspective to Resolution 1325 and questioning still how meaningful has been the participation of women and indigenous people in the resolution and in implementing the WPS agenda. And of course, your remarks on the need for security reform. So now I would like to introduce our final speaker, Bina Lakshmi Bina Nepram. Bina is presently the founder director of Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network and convener of Global Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, Gender, Justice, and Peace. Bina has spearheaded work on making women-led peace, security, and disarmament, as well as research in mitigating small arms and light weapons violence, and organized several Northeast India women peace congregations. She's also the author of 5 books, her 2 most recent being Where Are Our Women in Decision-Making on UN Security Council Resolution 1325 and Deepening Democracy, Diversity, and Women's Rights in India. In 2013, London-based organization Action on Armed Violence named Bina as one of the 100 most influential people in the world working on armed violence reduction. Bina, the floor is yours.
Bina, I think you might be on mute.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I want to wish everyone at Scrap Weapons as well as SOAS and fellow panelists a wonderful International Women's Day. I know we are at the time of history where a lot of sadness has been done because of the Ukraine conflict. And today I'm wearing clothes woven in Manipur with the colors of Ukraine, just to let them know that we are with all the people in the world who have been oppressed because of violent politics, and that is not the way to go. And thank you so much for invite and really looking forward to a good discussion. So what I'll do is when I was preparing for these notes, I will divide my presentation into 2 parts. One is I wrote a few lines on what I'm thinking about. Where do we go from here? Because everyone is so saddened. Everyone is so depressed at this ongoing conflict, which is now played out every day, every moment of our lives. And our pain heart goes to 1.7 million people who are right now displaced because of the conflict in Ukraine. So I wrote this following lines. We are at the moment in history, more than ever before, when the world order needs to be changed. If we are to have a world without pandemics and a world without wars. We are at the moment in history where the death of 6 million humans in a span of 2 years of pandemics is not enough dispensation of human life and existence. We are at the moment in history where the death of humans no longer count, that our bodies are built for maintaining and building empires. What do we have? And how do we then create a feminist leadership in disarmament at such a critical juncture of our history? How do we talk about women, peace, and security at a time when a nation marches on to another nation, bombs people, and still justifies it? I just wanted to share these thoughts and bring you the story of a country, of a part of the world where our own government denies that there is conflict. India, the world's largest democracy, has not allowed us to work on UN Security Council Resolution 1325. And India said this publicly at the UN forum, saying there's no conflict in India. So you cannot work on 1325, the title of our research, of our talk today. And I will, in the next 7 minutes left, we'll share how we exactly went around doing that. So it is a part of the world where I come from is Manipur in Northeast India. And I'm bringing some images if organizers allow me to share so that you're aware of this part of the world I'm talking about, yeah. And because images are, so powerful to be able to, so I don't know if you can see, is it coming out? All right. All right, so today I'm just going to share in the next 6 minutes or so, how have we done and worked on UN Security Council 1325, images of Manipur women selling water lilies in our market, just to give us a sense that there's still beauty out there in the world in spite of all the wars. Now, the current global armed conflicts, what is interesting is while Ukraine, Syria, what happened to the Rohingyas, all these are out in the press. But there are 21 known conflicts in the world, and look at the number of unknown conflicts which are happening right now, and yet no paper reports this. The story of Manipur and northeast of India, where I am coming from, and how we did work on 35 is a story of one of these 378 forgotten worlds conflicts. Just to say that many of us listening here are from scholars, so just to let us know how so many other things that is not there in Google search or in the textbooks that is subscribed to. And so why will we work on feminist leadership? We need to take account many of this. The region where I come from is this area which is shaded in red. It's called Manipur and northeast of India, home to 45 million indigenous people, 45, the number of size of Ukraine people. These were independent Asiatic nation states, and they were merged with the Union of India under duress in 1949. So we share boundaries with 5 countries. Now, what's happening to this part of India? This is home to South Asia's longest running armed conflict. There are 72 armed groups operating there, and look at the number of troops. So when I saw pictures of Ukraine, it was not different. I grew up in a war zone. I grew up in this red part of India. And if you think India is the world's largest democracy, you will think twice. In this part of India, we have a martial law. And Linda had mentioned she grew up in a martial law. I grew up in a martial law, not of the past, a martial law which continues still today from 1958 in our part of the world, in Manipur and northeast of India, yet the world doesn't know about it. But how beautiful many of its conflict areas are. These are images from our region, and I hope one day you come and visit us when things are a little better. But many of the world's conflict areas are also very interesting, that much of the world's conflict nowadays happen in biodiversity hotspots. And Inas had spoken about it from Libya. And 80% of the people who live in biodiversity hotspots are indigenous people. So these are some of the things that I would like to bring home to. These are images from Sikkim in my region and Manipur, where I was born. Different indigenous groups there. If you look at them, will you think they're from India? So when I first came from my region to India's capital, New Delhi, I was asked which country I was from, because our people look like this. And it's a very, very kind of feature. Now, what is interesting in this part of India is, even if you come to India with an Indian visa, you are not allowed in these territories. You need a special permit called restricted or protected area permit to enter there. So hardly any journalists are allowed there. That's why the news from this part of India has been shut out from the rest of the world for the last almost 60 plus years. Our history is also blanked out. Now, and there's a racialization of India is what I have seen personally, and also when I came to New Delhi. During coronavirus, many people from our part of India were asked to go back to China, even though they were leased in this way. This is what's happening. Now, what I would like to bring home is this. Manipur, where I was born, had its own written constitution, even before India wrote its own. And we already had our own constitution before India even had it. So it was a culturally very rich community. This is the script. Now, what's happening now is this, which brings to 1325. Now, because of the fact that many parts of this northeast of India were brought under duress, there is an ongoing political conflict. And what India did, as I mentioned, put 300,000 troops and imposed a martial law. This is how Indian military operates in our part of our world. There are 350 military stations. Every half a kilometer, there's army patrolling going on. That's how many of us are growing up in this part of the world. Not only that, as you saw in Ukraine, you saw in Myanmar, when democracy is crushed, what have people done? Take up arms. So when I was growing up as a young child there, I also saw several armed groups. And that's when my research started on small arms and light weapons. I didn't start because I love guns. I've never held, or owned a gun in my life, and never will I, because there's more power to life than a gun. So what I've seen is our lives being caught at the hands of the state, of the Indian Armed Forces, and the non-state. So imagine a young child growing up in this kind of environment, where we were always told, don't ask a question, you will be shot dead. So not only about the militarization of our lives, but our schools, our architectural sites have been all militarized in this part. Now, again, as I mentioned, you heard about the Rohingyas, but there are more than 300,000 internally displaced people in this part of Manipur and northeast of India. Yet there is no reportage, no research, no proper studies done on this. So I will just go back to now and why we started on this. So first of all, 50,000 people have lost their lives. So as a young child growing up in this region, what we did, there are two things that one does is try to find out. So we started the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network to respond to this conflict. So that's what we did, establish an organization. I was still a student like many of you here. And I was trained, I was preparing for Indian civil service. At the same time, I wanted to be a physicist. There are so many dreams that you have as a child. But when you grow up in a war zone, what do? You see this conflict every day in your life. And then what do? We said, let us do something. And we started the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network. Everyone hears about the Kashmir conflict, as I mentioned, but more than 1,500 extrajudicial killings happened. These are images of deaths in my part of the world. These are families we work with. So the Manipur Women Gun Survivors Network started doing it. And now, as we were doing this work, 1325 happened. When we saw 1325 happening, when I saw the document for the first time, I felt it was made for the women of Manipur. We took this document, and I remember with so much excitement when I found this document. The UN has many challenges, but one thing the UN is good, it's very good at really good documents and resolutions. We took it because India is a member of the United Nations, and we trained women all across Manipur on 1325. Not only Manipur, but across for northeast of India, which is 8 different states bordering 5 countries. In Manipur, we have an extraordinary women's movement, which has been there for the last 113 years. There are women with bamboo torches called Manipuri Mairapais. We involve, these are mothers and grandmothers of Manipur, like the mothers of the Plazo in Argentina, who have come out. These women have never been to schools in their lives, but they have come to the forefront of responding to conflict and violence. So involve them also to confront what I call the weaponization of our land and our lives. This is how the women of Manipur patrol the streets of night, defending our rights, asking for the repeal of the martial law. As I mentioned, the 1325 document, when we started it, Government of India says you cannot work on 1325 because there's no conflict. How can you lie to 45 million people when we have 300,000 troops and more than 72 armed insurgent groups pointing guns at us and says there's no damn conflict? So we started that this is not the way. Feminist leadership in disarmament is not given to us. Women are born leaders. And that's what we did. We went to every northeast of India states and galvanized women leaders from all of these conflict affected areas. We hosted women in Northeast India Women Peace Congregation. For the first time, women from different warring parties came together, and we said, where are the women in decision making? India, the world's largest democracies, have only 12% women in parliament. In Manipur, not even 1% women in this. And there are 17 peace talks in this region and not a single woman in it. To conclude, I would just share, we did not feel disheartened. In fact, we were emboldened by the fact that what inequality exists where we have been left out in decision making. Our wars are created by men, the guns are made by men, and we know how, I haven't even spoken about the coloniality of power, the arms industry, which has led to more than weapons being flooded from the global north to the global south. For every $1 of humanitarian aid given by the global north to the global south, they make us buy $10 worth of the weapons. So a disarmed future cannot happen if we do not confront the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, which produces 88% of the world's weapons. So this work that we did on where are the women in decision making, we did it because India wouldn't allow us to use the word women, peace, and security. So we created a document called Where Are Women in Decision Making and gave it to the government of India and drafted India's first national action plan on women, peace, and security. termed as Where Are the Women in Decision Making? It's now published as a book, and I'll be happy to send copies of it to anyone who would like it, so that you know how we did. We also not only created this, we drafted legislations and like helped members of parliament support it, and we passed, we sort of drafted and tabled draft resolution on women, peace and security in 2006 in the Indian Parliament. So that's how the different work that we galvanized with. At the international level, we worked at the UN, we worked with Nobel Women, Frontline, Freedom House, to be able to tell the story of some of these 300 plus forgotten conflict zones in the world, for which there is still an eminent need for women, peace and security. The recommendations that we have asked has been to remove the martial law, which is the greatest blot on India's democracy, demilitarize Manipur and northeast of India, set up a Truth and Reconciliatory Commission, and ensure that women human rights defenders are protected, because I myself have been threatened many times because of the work that we have done, because 43% of our members of parliament right now have criminal background records. So anyone working for peace, justice, and gender justice are seen a threat to a nation state. And I would like to end with some of the theorizing that there is a need for resistance, a resistance where women lead, a resistance not armed, but peaceful. We can make it happen. Ukraine has shaken all us up. And there are many stories like Ukraine, like Manipur, as I shared today, where it's so important to let the world that not just one UN Security Council Resolution 1325, but every piece on women in conflict and war, so many resolutions that have been passed by really well-meaning citizens and nations of the world must be implemented. We are at the moment in history, as I mentioned at the beginning, that a really paradigm shift is needed. And the future is female. The future is that women can lead it. And I thank all the team at Scrap Weapons and SOAS for making this happen. It may be a small group here, but we will put the torch like the women and the mothers of Manipur have done. As Ambassador Scott has mentioned, Our Excellency has mentioned, that we are building on the work of many of our mothers and grandmothers and the women of the world. And we will continue this. In spite of Ukraine, in spite of imperial powers, we will show them that we will resist war and violence and fight for peace till the end. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was another incredible presentation. Yeah, I think I will acknowledge myself, I had no idea about the conflict in Manipur, and I think you just perfectly highlighted the need for to take that lens where we deconstruct what we know, where we listen, and where we are much more inclusive in our approaches, and really call out those double standards in reporting that we see across the world right now. And I also think it's so empowering to hear the way that, we often wait for leadership, but it's not about waiting, it's about women becoming the leaders themselves. And I think what better message to spread on International Women's Day than the future is female. So on that note, I want to open up the floor for any questions that anybody has. We've already got one in the chat. I will read this question out. So it's quite a wide question, but so recognizing women's leadership instead of just focusing on their needs is a core part of the WPS agenda and the implementation of Resolution 1325. All our panelists today have shown how much this has been both possible and refused in the Global South, specifically in government representation. So the question is, how do we make the next step in populist countries such as India and those in war zones like Libya to call for or pressure those in power to provide women this space? So Ines, can I start with you?
Yes, of course. If I understand the question correctly, because it was disconnecting a bit, it's like, what exactly our recommendation to push for women participation, right, within a very specific, hard and complicated context? I think most of the peace processes in Libya, or what we call form peace processes that led to an outcome, like the Libyan political agreement, and then the Libyan political dialogue, or the Libyan political dialogue forum, has been led by external mediators. That's a very important thing to know. In external mediators, meaning the United Nations, the UNSMIL, the United Nations Special Envoy in Libya, have been leading these processes. It's important for any external mediations to include gender. That's a checklist that we always, people who are advocating for WPS, always include. If you have 80 meetings, if you have any formal meetings and negotiations, you have to include women. Sadly, that has not been the case in Libya. I think starting from there, maybe this can actually enhance women's participation in all levels in Libya, but also enhance providing gender measures to counter all of these challenges that women are facing on a daily basis. Having consultations is not enough, but having a systematic engagement with civil society and women, peace and security actors in Libya, it's also very crucial. It's not enough to have a meeting with me, or with other organizations, but to actually have a systematic engagement means that throughout the process, before designing the process, throughout the process, and after made the process. Also establishing monitoring mechanisms as well to enhance, the peace agreement in Libya, but also the involvement in women in different outcomes. For instance, when we established a government that is supported, the Government of National Accord, in the first political agreement, there's only 2 women and 1 woman in the end ended up in the government. That's a very important thing to follow up on. So what is happening, when we talk about gender equality, but also asserting issues such as sexual gender-based violence, it's highly stigmatized, but it cannot be, it has to be included. And it's a priority to do security and peace and security, because as we all know, all gender issues are not deemed serious, are not deemed important. And I think these are one of the entry points that can make a difference when it comes to involving more women in the peace process, but also in the different ways after the peace process has taken place.
Thank you so much, Inas. I think that there were several recommendations that were particularly interesting. You talked about the systematic engagement of women throughout the whole process. So not only at the moment when they sat down at the tables, but before and after as well. And establishing these monitoring mechanisms is super important. And so I think that the next question, perhaps we can start with Your Excellency Linda Scott, but I would open up to the panel as well, which is what have been your main obstacles in your work pushing women's participation into the security reforms that are needed in the WPS agenda?
Thank you very much, Anna. I think one thing that I tried to highlight is what has already been highlighted by Bina Lakshmi and Inas, and that is the whole thing of structure. I've spoken about education. What I want to say is that organization by women themselves is also just as important. I think what many people don't know is that the word girl child actually originates from Namibia. So how did that word actually start? I was there and I saw the process myself. I mean, it's incredible to think about it like this, but when I was this was in 1994. We were preparing for the fourth African Summit on Women. It was in Senegal. And we took the Beijing process very, very seriously in Namibia. Remember, we had been independent for 4 years by then. And remember that women at that time were considered as minors in our country. So if you were single and if you were under the age of 18, you were a minor. If you were a married woman, you had the same rights as a minor. So what we did was we had held regional meetings, and I must say this, that they were sponsored by UNESCO, by UNICEF. So those meetings, we invited people who were leaders, women leaders in the community. And you know how many of those women were completely and utterly illiterate. That was not important. It was just, were you recognized by your community and how strong was your leadership in the community? And we had one meeting after the next for a period of about 6 months. And every one of those meetings were asked, what were the issues? What were the two main issues that women faced? And the one issue came up, which was the fact that in our society at that time, people did not make a will. So men were dying, and then because of the culture, the whole family, the wife and children would lose everything and they would become destitute because of the culture. So we said that needed to change, and people had to learn to make a will so that women were protected and children were protected. And the second thing was that we wanted to focus on the girl child, because we recognized that girl children had very specific issues, that they were not even allowed to finish high school. So those two issues then were taken to our regional body, which was SADC, and then to Africa, and that's how it got to Beijing. So what I'm trying to say is that we as women, somehow, we were just very organized. Of course, we had the disagreements that usually happen when you've got civil society and you've got different political parties. Remember that we had just come out of a war. People had been fighting each other. We had serious human rights violations during our war. People thrown out of airplanes, people roasted over fire like a sheep. Terrible things. But we made a decision. We had to build our society, and we sat together. And I love the fact that Bina Lakshmi is talking about women from different parties coming together to talk. And I want to say that after the last elections, our Deputy Prime Minister brought together women and who had been elected, and they caucused across party lines on women's issues, and particularly on issues such as disarmament, so that they could build up structures across party lines to address the main questions which related to women and disarmament. So really, that is what I can encourage. But most of all, we must educate teachers, men and women, so that our boys and our girls can learn the language of peace. I was never taught the language of peace. I grew up in a violent society, and I can tell you that language is still there. How do we teach people to speak? I love what the Americans say. They use a phrase which I learned when I lived for a short while in New York: use your words. How do we use our words? Can we teach our children to use words of peace? Can we teach our women and our men to use words of peace? How do you express yourself when you're angry? How do you recognize yourself as this is my motion, but I want, so disarmament starts at the level of our kids. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really, really fascinating. Inez, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's very important to think about education and armament from a very early age. I completely agree. I think maybe my point, building up on what Her Excellency and also my respective colleague from India about the obstacles pushing women's participation in the security reforms. I think one thing that I've seen a pattern of the presentation that she done is the protection of a women and human rights defenders and the space to actually engage in such a serious conversation that are deemed by many of our political realities and governments as a threat as to their territorial interest. So even talking about gender justice is a threat to the national security. That's a main obstacle that right now we're actually talking about our own protection. You know, when I made the statement in the Security Council, one of the highest level in the UN, my government responded in retaliation upon my statement and have threatened me personally and my safety. I'm laughing it off, but that was really a critical time of my life. And that affected many of folks advocating for women's participation, and also these essentialist ideas and stereotypes that women in Libya, for instance, they don't know anything about peace and security. They don't own a militia, right? Women, they don't have a militia for them to understand what's going on. Very, very narrowed and very limited ideas of that. But also, finally, about how issues of this security reforms are lacking an interlinked and intersectional analysis, right, of the elephant, what we call the elephant in the room, right? If you talk to any household or family and in Libya, they tell you stop the arms in Libya. However, this disconnection of the conversations, what's happening on the ground and in a policy level, it's contributing to this challenges when it comes to security and reforms, and also the connection of the private sector and the public sector. I've seen in the article about Ukraine that Germany broke the peace finally after years to making weapons to different countries like Saudi Arabia, who's been involved directly in Libya and Yemen and different contexts. Many of the European countries have been indirectly engaged by the private sector, by companies, are protected in these territories. So it's very, very important to understand these interlinkages that feminists more often provide, like my colleagues here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I think that's so true. I think just because your hand is not pulling the trigger does not mean that you're not complicit in all of this. I think it's really important to point out. Bina Lakshmi, would you like to add?
Okay, I'm always flocking. So a couple of things to be very clear. I've been working for almost a decade and a half on these issues, trying to find, for us, peace is not a project, it's a commitment of a lifetime. People like myself and many others and Inez here have dedicated our life towards peace, have done nothing else in our life than trying to find solutions. So here are some of the things that I would like to share together with all of you at SCRAB and at SOAS. Number one, you know, Martin Luther King in his Nobel acceptance speech, there are 4 quadrants in which the world will continue to be in turmoil: colonization, militarization, patriarchy, and the corporatization of our lives. This is what is the 4 quadrant that will keep turning around this world, okay? And women own only 99% of the world's resources. Men own only 1% in all the women in this Zoom room and all the women listening. I'm sorry, I'm sounding a little bit, but it's, well, thinking about this seminar today, it's like, what is a solution? Charles Tilly, a sociologist, said that a state is a nation state is like an organized crime. They are the ones who make the war weapons. America became America because of the number of weapons sold in World War I and World War II. They're the world's largest supplies of military weapons in the whole world. And who laughs their way to the bank while 1.7 million Ukrainians are displaced, or 300,000 in my home state and area? It is the war manufacturers. They form lobbies around our parliaments. They are the ones, together, the corporatization of our democracy. If we, the women, if we, the concerned citizenry of the world, do not realize this, we cannot change the world. There will be more and more Ukraines, ever, because someone is benefiting from this war. So that's one thing in feminists. So that's why a feminist foreign policy is a need of the hour. An inclusive feminist foreign policy where we divert. That's why I said in the beginning of the speech, we need a strong paradigm shift now. Otherwise, the next 50 years, I've seen 40 years of war in my home state, a war which no one knows, but a war that nonetheless continues. And we do not want the next 40 years for our children and grandchildren to grow up knowing they can't do anything about it. So we have to using what's there at the UN, what's there in our nation states, what's in our communities. That's why today my slogan for International Women's Day is Women of the World Unite. Because you see, the question which came, what kind of space do women have to be provided? We don't need any space. We are the space ourselves. It's just that we do not realize our space because we have been divided along racial lines, color lines, regional lines. We have been divided again and again. The fact that women's household work has never been recognized as work is because of the whole capitalist nature of the world in which women have been relegated to the absence of not being resource creators. And hence, we are not in decision making. That's why 1325, women for us, for villages in Manipur, how we have taught 1325 is that women should be in decision making, socially, economically, politically, that we have to be like the Namibian women, 50% of them, 50% women, and we have in our region, we said now, no to peace talks without women in Manipur and northeast of India, no to any decision making without whether half the decision making people are like left out. So we, the women, have to empower ourselves economically. We have to contest elections. We have to get into social decision making. This is 1325 for us. It's not another UN document sitting in the dockyards. We have to make these documents real because good people have spent years and decades thinking about it. So the education that, that Linda has mentioned about, really important, starting from grade 1. Ask, and if you have children, ask your girl child, they are being abused from kindergarten by the boys because they have been told to lift girls' skirt. I know this from our families. We have been repeatedly struggling. The way Russia has invaded Ukraine was a show. It's about really toxic masculinity that we will not let Ukraine be. And it's as if Ukraine is being torn apart between two world powers. You know, sometimes the feminization of the conflict in Ukraine shows it's like a woman being torn apart by two power structures. Stop it. We have our own space. This space, the women ourselves, we need to realize it and powerfully use that space to turn the tide of power in this world, because the men have not brought peace to the world. If they haven't, then we have to turn the tables now. This is my plea on International Women's Day. And we have to keep going this way. There's no other way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bina. And thank you so much, Inas and Your Excellency, Linda Scott. Honestly, I think that we would want to continue this, this webinar and to ask so many more questions. But unfortunately, we have already reached the end. But as I mentioned, with a lot of questions that remain unquestioned, but nevertheless, this was an amazing discussion. And it was very interesting to have your different perspectives from also 3 different countries, different life experiences, but all working together also to advance women's participation, to advance also an intersectional approach to women, peace and security agenda. And just to conclude, I would like to thank the audience as well for being here with us, and to remind everyone of our next webinar. Please join us. It will be on the 22nd of March, also at 2 p.m. And it will be on voices from feminist theoretical approaches to women, peace and security, and feminist foreign policy. So we will also have discussion here on the theoretical approaches surrounding feminism, and will be very interesting. So thank you so much to each and every one of you, and we hope to see you very soon again in our next webinar.
Thank you very much, and happy Women's Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just a reminder that you can stay up to date with all of Scrap's work and join our newsletter or follow us on social media. And a video recording of this webinar will soon be available on Scrap Weapons YouTube channel. And if you are a student and would like to receive a certificate of participation, please email scrap.weapons@soas.com. And thank you once again for a fantastic presentation today. And we are very much looking forward to the next in the series. Thank you.